Welcome to session 320 of the Bible in a Year commentary. If you started this series on the 1st of January, then today should be the 16th of November. Today we'll be looking at Philippians 3 to 4 and Psalm 10. But so far in Philippians, we've read as Paul has greeted the church in Philippi, giving them an update on his life and then encouraging them to live lives worthy of their calling in the gospel, being united in one mind. The letter was likely written around 55 to 63 CE and was an encouragement and thanks after the Philippians had sent Paul a care package while in prison. Paul planted the church in Philippi in Acts 16, one of the first in Macedonia. In his letter, he praises them for their faithfulness in his absence. He then prayed for their growth in love and knowledge, urging them to live in a manner worthy of the gospel. Paul used his circumstances as an example, noting how even his imprisonment helped spread the gospel. He rejoiced that others were sharing Jesus, whether for genuine motives or self-interest. For Paul, life or death meant Christ would be exalted, inspiring the Philippians not to fear persecution. He then called them to unity and humility, using Jesus' example of emptying himself for the gospel. Paul encouraged them to work out their faith relying on God's strength. He also praised Timothy and Epaphroditus as examples of this selfless dedication to Christ. He offered them as models for the Philippians to follow. But let's jump into today's reading, Philippians 3 to 4. If the Philippians are to continue to live in a way worthy of the gospel, then they need to be wary of those who would cause problems in the church. He specifically addresses those who mutilate the flesh. That's Philippians 3 verse 2. This would have been the same group that Paul mentioned in his letter to the Galatians, who were going around telling people that they needed to be circumcised to be saved and considered a proper believer. Paul points to himself and others who are circumcised. They no longer trust in their Jewish roots or circumcision to save them. Instead, they trust in Jesus and worship him in the Spirit. If there was anyone who could trust in their culture and traditions, it is Paul. He was an Israelite and was circumcised according to the proper rituals. He was from the tribe of Benjamin, and he was a strict follower of the law, a Pharisee. There was no one who was as passionate as he was or as obedient to the law as he was. And yet none of that meant anything once he had met Jesus. Now there are no traditions or cultures or practices that mean anything to Paul outside of Jesus. He has willingly set all of that aside so he can properly pursue Jesus. Paul's righteousness doesn't come from following a code or set of laws. It comes from faith in Jesus. The end goal for Paul is to participate in the resurrection power of Jesus, both in this life and after death. But that only happens when believers also participate in his sufferings and death. This isn't a goal that Paul can say he's already reached, but one he's constantly working towards. This is because he has now been claimed by Jesus. Everything he has done has not been in his own strength, but in Jesus' strength. Paul's only focus is on the end goal of resurrection and ultimate reconciliation with Jesus. This way of thinking requires a level of maturity, and so Paul encourages believers who think differently to allow God to shape their thinking and reveal this to them. Paul then offers himself up as someone worthy of imitating. There are those, presumably those who are spreading circumcision, whose ways of living make them enemies of Jesus' work on the cross. For some, that means chasing after rules to follow rather than trusting in Jesus to save them. For others, it's their own selfish desires that set them at odds with the cross. They seek only to satisfy their own desires. The things that they celebrate are the very things that they should be ashamed of. And all they can focus on are the things that the world says are important. Instead, the Philippians should see themselves as different, as citizens of heaven who aren't to hold to any particular earthly culture, but to a heavenly culture. As citizens of heaven with their eyes set on Jesus, he will transform and renew them. It is only the power of Jesus that will ultimately redeem the Philippians and see them reconciled with him. Based on all that, Paul encourages the Philippians to stand firm and give them a series of challenges. First, they need to address any conflict in their midst. There are a couple of women, Euodia and Syntyche, who have been in disagreement with one another. May the church work together to help these women reconcile. Next, the Philippians are to be marked by their rejoicing in God and by their gentleness. Rather than be anxious or worrying, they should seek to hand everything over to God through prayer and then thanksgiving. That way, peace will guard their hearts and their mind. They should also focus on all that is good, whether it is true or honourable or just or pure or pleasing or commendable. By focusing on these things, the Philippians will be then shaped by them. Then Paul thanks them for the gift that they sent him and in turn turns it into a learning opportunity. In many ways, Paul didn't need a gift because he's learned how to be content no matter what he has. If he has a lot, great. If he has little, fine. In every circumstance, Paul has learned to be content in God, and the Philippians should model this. That's not to say that Paul isn't grateful for the gift he sent. While he did not need it, The sending of the gift allowed the Philippians to practice their generosity and share in his struggles. Because of this, God will satisfy their needs in Jesus. Paul then ends with his final greetings. At its core, Philippians is a letter to those who are already established in the faith in order to persevere in it, to practice the self-sacrificial humility of Jesus, to trust in Jesus for their salvation at all times, not falling into the traps that is their morals or cultural practices that make them good, to fight for the unity of their community while practicing patience and joy and peace, focusing on what is good. That is the letter to Philippians. Now let's look at Psalm 10. This psalm is attributed to King David and falls into the category of lament psalm. Interestingly, this psalm continues on the acrostic of Psalm 9. Here is a summary of the structure, but I would recommend checking out the written version of this commentary in the description to see the structure properly for yourself. And we start with verse 1 to the first part of verse 3, Lamed, trouble is near, but God seems far. The second half of verse 3 to the first half of verse 5, Nun, the nature of the wicked. The second half of verse 5 to verse 6, Samek, the wicked seem to go unpunished. Verse 7 to the first part of verse 8, Pay, the wicked curse, oppress and ambush others. The second half of verse 8 to verse 9, Ayin, the wicked search for ways to oppress the poor. Verses 10 to 11, Sade, the helpless are crushed, seemingly forgotten by God. Verses 12 to 13, Kof, a cry to God to rise. Verse 14, Reish, God isn't far, he does see. Verses 15 to 16, Sin or Shin, bring judgment on the wicked as the king of the nations. And then verses 17 to 18, Tor, God does hear and he strengthens the innocent. He is a just God. Though clearly linked to Psalm 9, this psalm has a very different tone. Rather than starting off focusing on the goodness of God and then introducing their problems into that, here the psalmist is consumed by their struggles. To them it feels like God is far away, that he is hiding. He's surrounded by suffering and pain and has to deal with the accusations of the wicked who say there is no God, and the hurting who say God has forgotten them. And there are some times when life feels like this, that there is no justice, that the wicked get away with whatever they want and that the poor suffer. There is part of each of us that longs for justice, and in these moments it can seem like there is none. So the psalmist turns to God and throws these questions at him. They ask God to be active and not forget those in need. They ask God why the wicked seem to get away with whatever they want, confident that God won't do anything. The psalmist grounds themselves in the truth that God does hear and does care, and then appeals to God's nature. He is the king of the nations and a just king who accepts no wickedness. He will defeat the wicked and protect those in need. While the psalm started off being very bleak, it ends on a high note. There's a sense of victory and confidence that God is just and faithful to his people. When we take Psalm 9 and Psalm 10 together, we more clearly see the contrast that we noticed yesterday. Some days you might start with God and then move to address your problems. Then on others, all you can do is bring your problems and work through them before you can stand in the truth of his faithfulness. What's important is that when we lament, we turn to God, we honestly bring our complaints to him, we ask him to intervene, and we trust in his faithfulness. The exact order and structure that you do those things in does not matter. Thanks for joining us today. Take a moment to reflect on what you've read and share your thoughts or questions below. If you're watching in the future, then you can click here for the next session, or you can find the full playlist just down here. To receive these daily commentaries in your email inbox, subscribe via the link in the description below. Have a great day, and I'll see you tomorrow.